Kraków, 1943. A woman stands at a butcher's block in a garrison kitchen. Steam rises around her. Her apron is spotless. The SS officers eating in the next room call her the best cook in occupied Poland. She smiles when they say this. She has been waiting 8 months for them to trust her completely. They do now. That was her first mistake, letting them trust her. It was their last. Her name was Helena Górska. She was 31 years old. She spoke fluent German with a Bavarian accent she'd learned from a radio program. She could debone a rabbit in 40 seconds. She could identify the early neurological symptoms of rabies in an infected animal from 12 meters. She knew how to grind infected brainstem tissue into sausage meat in a way that left no visible trace. And by the winter of 1943, she had used every one of those skills to engineer what SS medical records would later describe, in clinical language that barely contained the horror, as a mass neurological incident of unknown origin affecting 207 personnel. Unknown origin. That is what the Germans wrote. That is what they told Berlin. That is what the garrison survivors repeated, years later, in trembling voices, when they tried to explain why grown men in SS uniforms had stood in the snow outside the garrison barracks, convulsing, unable to swallow, howling at sounds no one else could hear. Helena Górska was never charged. She was never arrested. She walked out of that garrison on a grey Tuesday morning in January 1944, carrying a small cloth bag and her kitchen knife wrapped in brown paper. And she disappeared into the population of a country that had already learned to make people disappear. This is the story of how she did it. Not the sanitized version. Not the version that makes resistance look clean or simple or morally uncomplicated. The version where a woman looked at the tools available to her, a kitchen, a grinder, a population of infected animals living in the forests east of the city, and made a calculation that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She would later say, in a single recorded testimony given to a Jewish documentation center in 1967, that she did not feel like a hero. She felt like a cook. I used what I had, she said. I had a kitchen. I had knowledge. I had access. And I had nothing left to lose. We'll get to what she lost. We'll get to the moment she made the decision. But first, you need to understand who Helena Górska was before the war turned her into something the German medical establishment could not explain. She was born in 1912 in a small village 40 kilometers east of Kraków, the second of 4 children in a farming family that had worked the same land for 3 generations. Her father kept livestock, cattle, pigs, 6 goats, and at various times a rotating population of chickens that her mother cooked, with an attention to spice and technique that bordered on devotion. The family was not wealthy by any measure. They ate what they grew and what they slaughtered and what the season permitted. But there was always enough, and the kitchen in that farmhouse was the warmest room in the building. And Helena understood from the time she was 6 years old that the person who controlled the kitchen controlled the house. Her mother, Bronislawa, was a formidable woman. She stood 158 centimeters tall and had hands calloused from 20 years of farm work. And she cooked everything from memory. No recipes, no written instructions, just a sensory knowledge of temperature and texture and time that she passed to Helena the way other mothers passed down prayers. Helena learned to judge the doneness of a pork roast by pressing it with 2 fingers. She learned to tell when lard had reached the right temperature for rendering by the sound it made in the pan. She learned critically to identify sick animals. This was not incidental knowledge in a farming household. It was survival knowledge. A sick pig that entered the food supply could destroy a family's winter reserves. A diseased cow that went undetected could contaminate the milk. Bronislawa had developed, over decades of animal husbandry, a catalogue of symptoms that she drilled into all 4 of her children with the same intensity she used for prayers and mathematics. Helena was her most attentive student. By the time Helena was 12, she could identify hoof and mouth disease from the way an animal stood. By 14, she could tell the difference between a pig with swine fever and one simply suffering from heat. By 16, she had watched her father slaughter a cow he suspected of bovine tuberculosis, bury it in line 3 kilometers from the farm, and spend 2 weeks watching the rest of the herd for symptoms. She absorbed all of it. She filed it away. She did not yet know why she was so interested. She would understand later. In 1930, at the age of 18, Helena left the village for Kraków. She had secured a position as a kitchen assistant in a restaurant on Sweska Street that served traditional Polish food to a mixed clientele of academics, merchants, and minor civil servants. The restaurant was run by a man named Władek Ostrowski, 52 years old, who had trained in Vienna and returned to Kraków with a fanatical commitment to the precision of European culinary technique. He was not a warm man. He was demanding and exacting, and occasionally cruel in the way that kitchen environments in that era frequently were. But he recognized talent immediately, and within 6 months of Helena's arrival, he had moved her from prep work to sauce production, and within a year, she was running the cold kitchen. She stayed for 8 years. She learned everything Ostrowski had to teach her: classical French technique, Polish traditional preparation, the chemistry of fermentation and curing and smoking. She learned how to make sausage. This is important. She learned the specific mechanics of sausage production, how to select cuts, how to proportion fat to lean, how to calibrate salt and spice, how to use casings, and most importantly, how to use the grinding process itself to incorporate ingredients that a diner eating the final product would never detect by taste or appearance alone. By 1938, Helena was 26 years old and widely regarded as one of the most skilled cooks in Kraków. She had married a historian named Tomasz Wisniewski, a quiet, meticulous man who wore the same 3 suits in rotation and was writing a monograph on 14th century Polish land records that he would never finish. They had a small apartment near the Planty Gardens. They had books stacked on every surface. They had a daughter named Agnieszka, born in October 1937, who had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness. They had a life. Then, September 1939 arrived, and the life ended. The German army entered Kraków on September 6, 1939. They did not bomb the city extensively. Kraków was too culturally valuable to destroy, a prize to be displayed, not a ruin to be surveyed. The Nazis had specific plans for Kraków. It would become the capital of the general government, the administrative heart of occupied Poland, which meant it would be flooded with German administrative and military personnel who needed to be housed, supplied, and fed. In the first weeks of the occupation, Helena watched the transformation of her city with a flat, analytical gaze that those who knew her would later describe as uncanny. She watched the German flags go up on the public buildings. She watched the roundups begin. Jewish men first, then academics and clergy, then anyone deemed to be a potential organizer of resistance. She watched her husband's colleagues from the university dragged from their offices. She watched the Judenrat established and the ghetto boundaries drawn. She watched all of it, and she said very little, and she went to work every morning and cooked. Tomasz was arrested in November 1939. He was not a political man. He was not a resistance organizer. He was a historian who had made the mistake in the first weeks of the occupation of attending a meeting of university faculty called to discuss the German directive shutting down all Polish higher education. The Gestapo had informants at the meeting. Tomasz was arrested, along with 43 other academics, in what became known locally as the Sonderaktion Kraków. He was transported to Sachsenhausen. Helena received one postcard, dated February 1940, in which he wrote only that he was well and that she should take Agnieszka to stay with her parents in the village. She never heard from him again. She would learn years later that he had died at Mauthausen in the summer of 1941, of causes the German records listed as heart failure, which was what the records called a great many things. Agnieszka she did send to the village. She packed her daughter's small cloth bag with 3 dresses, a pair of boots, and a photograph of the family taken in the summer of 1938, and she put her 4-year-old daughter on a horse cart heading east. And she watched the cart until she could not see it anymore. She did not cry. She went home, sat in the kitchen of her apartment, and spent 3 hours sharpening every knife she owned. What do you do when you have lost everything a person can lose, and you are still standing in a kitchen that smells like your husband's coffee and your daughter's milk? What do you do When you are a woman in an occupied city, invisible to the men who now control every aspect of your existence, possessed of a set of skills that looks on the surface like nothing more threatening than the ability to feed people. If you are Helena Górska, you start paying very careful attention. The restaurant on Sweska Street did not close during the occupation. It changed clientele. Władek Ostrowski died of a heart attack in the spring of 1940, and a German administrative officer named Konrad Fassbinder, who had been assigned to oversee the Krakow food supply chain, decided the building was too good to waste and requisitioned it as a dining facility for mid-level German officers and officials. He needed a cook. The restaurant's existing staff recommended Helena. Fassbinder, a tall man with a civil servant's careful eyes, interviewed her for 11 minutes. She cooked him a simple meal: roast pork with caraway, potato dumplings, a dark bread pudding with plum sauce, and he ate every bite and offered her the position before he'd finished the last of the pudding. She accepted. She was, from that afternoon forward, the head cook for a German administrative dining facility in the heart of occupied Krakow. She cooked for German officers. She learned their preferences, their dietary quirks, their allergies. She learned which ones drank too much and which ones watched their portions. She learned how to be invisible in a room full of men who saw her only as the source of their meals, which is one of the most effective forms of camouflage ever devised. For 2 years, she cooked. She fed them. She listened. She was extraordinarily good at listening. German officers, it turned out, spoke freely in front of kitchen staff. The assumption that Polish servants were intellectually beneath the conversation was not merely a social pose. It was a genuine belief, an article of faith in the ideology of Aryan supremacy that made the German military establishment functionally blind to the intelligence being gathered by every cook, cleaner, laundress, and doorman in occupied Poland. Helena's German was flawless by this point, and she never let the officers know it. She played the part of a woman with limited comprehension, nodding when directly addressed, retreating quickly when dismissed. While she nodded and retreated, she memorized. She memorized troop movements, discussed over dinner. She memorized personnel transfers. She memorized the names of informants, mentioned carelessly in the middle of conversations she was supposedly too simple to follow. She passed what she gathered to a network she had joined in the spring of 1941, a cell of the Armia Krajowa, the Home Army, run out of a bakery 3 streets away by a woman named Agata Chmielowska, who was 57 years old and looked like someone's grandmother, and had helped coordinate the movement of 17 downed Allied airmen out of occupied Poland in the previous 18 months. Helena's intelligence work was useful. It was not, she would later acknowledge, transformative. She was gathering information, not acting on it. The Germans she was feeding were administrators and mid-level officers, not decision-makers. The damage she could do through intelligence alone was limited. Then, in October 1942, the 7th SS Garrison Company moved into the old Potocki estate on the eastern edge of the city. 231 men, an active combat formation that had rotated back from the Eastern Front for rest, reinforcement, and reassignment. They brought with them a garrison commander, a Hauptsturmführer, named Rudolf Lauber, who was 38 years old and had served on the Eastern Front for 14 months, and had acquired in that time the particular quality of violence that long exposure to systematic killing produces in men who were not entirely stable to begin with. Lauber was not a bureaucrat. He was not an administrator. He was a combat officer who understood force as the primary language of human interaction, and he had been given 230 men and a commandeered estate and instructions to maintain order in the eastern districts of Krakow. His first act was to execute 6 Poles from the surrounding neighborhood for a curfew violation. His second was to establish a working kitchen. He needed a cook who could feed over 200 men, 3 meals a day, and Fassbinder, his administrative contact, recommended Helena. She was brought to the estate for an interview in the first week of November 1942. Laub looked at her for approximately 4 seconds before he stopped looking at her at all. She was a woman. She was Polish. She was kitchen staff. She was, in his cognitive framework, furniture. He told Fassbinder to confirm the arrangement and went back to his paperwork. Helena took the job. She moved into the small room adjacent to the garrison kitchen, a stone-floored space with a single window that looked out over the estate's back courtyard, and began cooking for 231 SS soldiers. She was the only kitchen staff for the first 2 weeks. Then Laube assigned her 4 Polish men from the labor pool to work as kitchen assistants. Their names were Benedict, Cyril, Rizard, and a boy of about 16 who said his name was Joseph. She trained them carefully, kept them close, and told them nothing about what she was thinking. Because she was thinking about something. She had been thinking about it since her second day in the garrison, when she walked the estate grounds at 6 in the morning and found, in the tall grass along the eastern wall, a dead fox. She crouched over it for a long time. The fox had been dead for less than 24 hours. It had no visible wounds. Its posture in death was contorted in a way she recognized. The rigid limbs, the arched back, the expression of the jaw. She had seen this before, not in a fox, in a dog, on her parents' farm, when she was 11 years old. A dog that had been bitten by something in the forest and had spent 3 days in the barn becoming something unrecognizable before her father put it down with a single rifle shot. Rabies. Lissa, the oldest fear in the human relationship with animals. A virus so ancient and so perfectly engineered for neural destruction that it has been inspiring terror in human populations for 4,000 years. She stood up from the dead fox and looked at the forest on the other side of the wall and understood that the forest contained more foxes, that the region around Kraków had been experiencing an animal epidemic of rabies for the past 18 months, driven by the disruption of the ecosystem that war and occupation had produced, that the foxes, along with infected dogs, wolves, and bats, were carrying the virus through a landscape in which the normal culling mechanisms, gamekeepers, hunters, controlled animal management, had been almost entirely eliminated by the war. She also understood, standing there in the cold November grass, that she worked in a kitchen that was responsible for sourcing and preparing all the meat for 231 SS soldiers. She went back inside and made breakfast. For the next 8 weeks, she did nothing except establish herself. She cooked with meticulous care. She learned the garrison's rhythms. When Laube inspected the kitchen, which he did every Thursday at 0800, when the supply deliveries arrived, Tuesdays and Fridays, which soldiers used the kitchen as a pass-through and which ones ignored it entirely. She memorized the layout of every storage room, every cold cellar, every outbuilding. She identified the 2 guards who sometimes took small bribes in the form of extra bread or an early access to the evening meal. She learnt exactly how much oversight was applied to the sourcing of kitchen supplies. The answer was very little. Helena was expected to maintain a food budget, submit weekly supply requests to Fassbinder's office, and produce 3 meals a day that kept the garrison functioning. How she sourced the specific ingredients, which local farmers she contracted, which markets she used, how she supplemented the official ration allocations, was not Laube's concern. He had larger problems. He had patrols to coordinate and informants to manage and a quota of arrests that Berlin expected him to maintain. This was the gap. This was what Helena had been looking for, not a gap in the fence or a gap in the guard schedule, a gap in the administrative imagination, the assumption that the kitchen was beneath oversight because the kitchen was beneath dignity. She passed a message to Agata Chmielowska in the middle of December 1942. It was written on a strip of paper no wider than 2 centimeters, tucked inside a loaf of bread, delivered to the bakery by Benedict, who thought he was simply running an errand. The message said, "I need to know everything about the rabies situation in the eastern forests. Who knows where the infected animals are? Who is tracking the outbreak? Reply through the usual channel." The reply came 8 days later. It was longer than she expected. The rabies epizootic in the forests east of Kraków had been documented by a veterinarian named Stanislaw Gruchalski, who had been maintaining unofficial records of infected animal sightings and deaths throughout the occupation. He was part of a small network of Polish agricultural professionals who had continued their monitoring work underground, partly out of professional habit and partly because they understood that an uncontrolled rabies outbreak in the animal population could spread to humans and complicate an already catastrophic public health situation. Gruchalski had identified multiple infection clusters, areas of the forest where infected foxes, wolves, and dogs were concentrated. He had a map. He was willing to share it with Helena. She met him once on a Sunday afternoon in January 1943, in the sacristy of a church 6 blocks from the garrison. He was a small man in his 50s, with soil under his fingernails and the careful, methodical manner of a scientist who had spent his career in the field rather than a laboratory. He spread the map on the altar table. He showed her the clusters. He explained the pathophysiology of infection in terms that she followed without difficulty. He told her the virus concentrated in neural tissue, the brain, the brainstem, the spinal cord. He told her that in infected animals, the salivary glands also carried high viral loads. He told her that transmission via consumption of infected neural tissue was theoretically possible, though the evidence base was limited. He paused here and looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking of doing?" he asked. "What I'm thinking of doing," Helena said, "is feeding the 7th SS Garrison Company." Gruchalski was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The animals will need to be caught in early-stage infection, after the first neurological symptoms appear. But before death, the viral load will be highest at that point. Can it be done? I know 2 men who have been tracking the clusters. They know the forest well enough." He folded the map. "How will you introduce the tissue into the food supply?" "Sausage," she said. "I make it every week. Ground meat. It accepts anything." He nodded slowly. "Neural tissue grinds poorly. It will need to be minced very fine first, mixed with high-fat pork to mask the texture, heavily spiced." "I know how to make sausage," Helena said. She did not ask him whether what she was doing was right. She did not ask him to tell her it was justified. She did not need moral permission from a man she had met 40 minutes ago. She had been asking herself that question since November, in the darkness of her stone-floored room, lying on a cot 300 meters from where 231 SS soldiers slept. She had measured it carefully. She had looked at it from every angle. She had thought about Thomas. She had thought about Agnieszka in the village. She had thought about the 6 men Laube had executed for curfew violation, whose wives she had heard screaming from 4 streets away. She had made her decision. She was here to execute it. The procurement operation began in February 1943 and ran for 6 weeks. Gruchalski's contacts, she never knew their names, he never gave them to her, worked the forest clusters on specific nights, using methods she didn't ask about, catching animals in early-stage infection. The infected animals were brought to a location she never visited, a barn outside the city, managed by a man she knew only as the veterinarian's cousin. There, the neural tissue was extracted under Gruchalski's supervision, brainstem material primarily, some spinal cord, and processed into a form that could be incorporated into a food preparation without detection. Helena received the material on 4 separate occasions between February and late March 1943. Each delivery came through a chain of 3 people, none of whom knew the full picture. The material arrived at the garrison in containers that appeared to be standard lard or tallow, a thick, pale substance that smelled unremarkable and looked, to anyone not specifically looking for something wrong, like ordinary rendered fat. What it was, specifically, was emulsified neural tissue from 12 infected animals, 4 foxes, 6 dogs, and 2 wolves, suspended in lard at a ratio that Gruchalski had calculated to maximize viral load while maintaining a consistency that would incorporate seamlessly into the sausage mixture. She used it in the sausage production. She used it over the course of 4 separate production runs, spread across 6 weeks, each run producing enough sausage to feed 200 men, 3 to 4 portions each. She never used it in anything else. Only sausage. For reasons that were both practical and strategic, sausage was heavily spiced, heavily processed, produced in large quantities, and consumed by the entire garrison without exception. Laube himself ate it. His officers ate it. Sausage was democratic that way. She varied the batches deliberately, some heavier in pork, some with more garlic. One with a regional spice blend she told the soldiers was a Kraków speciality, so that no one batch stood out. She established, during these weeks, the habit of offering the garrison extra sausage, She encouraged Benedict and the other kitchen assistants to serve generously. She made the sausage slightly better than usual, richer, more savory, so that the soldiers sought it out, asked for second servings, compared it favorably to sausage they'd had in other postings. They ate it with enthusiasm, 207 of them. The first symptom reports began appearing in early April 1943. A garrison medical log, obtained after the war and held in the archives of the Institute of National Remembrance, records the initial presentations in clinical language that does nothing to contain the reality behind it. April 4th, 1943, 3 personnel reporting headache and fever assessed as influenza, light duty assigned. April 8th, 1943, 11 personnel reporting similar symptoms: fever, headache, malaise. 1 patient reporting difficulty swallowing, assessed as possible influenza outbreak. Garrison physician informed, April 11th, 1943, 22 personnel symptomatic. 3 cases of apparent hydrophobia noted, patients exhibiting acute distress when offered water. Garrison physician requests consultation with Kraków Military Medical Command, April 14th, 1943. 41 personnel symptomatic, 7 displaying severe neurological symptoms, including spasm, agitation, hypersalivation. 2 patients in restraints following violent episodes. Medical emergency declared. Hydrophobia, the ancient name for rabies, comes from this symptom: the terror of water, the inability to swallow, the painful laryngeal spasms triggered by the sight or sound, or even the thought of drinking. In mid-April, there were SS soldiers in the Potocki State Garrison who could not swallow their own saliva. There were men who had fought at Stalingrad and Kharkov who were afraid of a glass of water. There were officers who had administered mass executions without visible distress, who were now strapped to their bunks, howling at sounds the men outside the door could not hear. The garrison's physician, a man named Kessman, had never seen a rabies outbreak in humans before. He had never expected to. Rabies was a disease of unvaccinated peasants and rural dogs, not of SS Garrison Companies in a major European city. He initially resisted the diagnosis. He considered alternatives: botulism, a toxic contaminant in the water supply, some atypical form of encephalitis. He ordered tests that took days to produce results, and meanwhile, 41 men became 67, became 94. On April 17th, Berlin was informed. The message was sent through secure Gestapo communications and described in language calibrated to avoid alarm: a neurological illness of undetermined etiology, affecting a significant portion of garrison personnel. Berlin responded the following day with a team of 3 SS physicians and an instruction that the matter be handled with maximum discretion. The 7th Garrison Company's situation was not to be reported to civilian medical authorities. It was not to be discussed with other garrison units. It was, above all, not to be allowed to become a story. They were afraid of what it would do to morale. They were afraid of what it would mean if Polish civilians learned that 200 SS soldiers had been incapacitated by an unknown illness in a comfortable estate on the edge of a city the Reich was supposed to control completely. They were afraid, though they did not articulate this clearly even in private, of the implication that something had been done to them. The Berlin physicians arrived and spent 3 days in the garrison. They examined patients in every stage of infection. They reviewed Kessman's logs. They tasted the water. They tested the food stores. They found nothing obviously wrong with anything. They were looking for a bomb. What had been planted was something older and quieter and altogether less visible than a bomb. On April 21st, one of the Berlin physicians requested an interview with the garrison kitchen staff. Helena had been preparing for this possibility for weeks. She had prepared for it the way she prepared everything: methodically, specifically, without panic. She had cleaned the kitchen with particular thoroughness after each production run involving the infected material. She had disposed of the containers using a method arranged through Agata Chmielowska's network. They were removed from the garrison in pieces in separate waste streams on separate days. The equipment she had used, the grinder, the mixing bowls, the casing equipment, had been disassembled, cleaned with boiling water and lye soap, and reassembled. She had used the same grinder for the regular pork sausage runs in the weeks following the infected batches, so that any residual trace was buried under subsequent normal production. And she had a story. A good story. A story built from specific operational details that she rehearsed in her stone room in the hours before dawn, in the same calm, iterative way she might rehearse a new recipe. The physician who interviewed her was named Dr. Werner Schreiber. He was 45, methodical, and exhausted by 3 days in a garrison full of dying men. He sat across from her in the kitchen office, a small room off the main prep area, and he asked his questions through a Polish interpreter who was clearly uncomfortable with the situation. What meat did she source, and from where? She gave him the suppliers' names: 2 legitimate Polish farmers, 1 German supply depot, and the documentation she kept meticulously in the kitchen ledger. He reviewed it. Everything was in order. What were the garrison's recent menus? She produced the menu records, which she also kept in the ledger. He reviewed them. Sausage appeared regularly, as it did in every garrison kitchen in occupied Europe. Did she have samples of current food stores? She did. He tested them. They were clean. When were the most recent sausage batches produced? She showed him the production dates in the ledger. The dates she showed him were the regular clean batches produced in late March and early April. The infected batches had been produced earlier, in February and early March, and those production records no longer existed in any form Schreiber could access. He asked her if she had noticed anything unusual about any of the meat she had received. He watched her face very carefully when he asked this. She thought for a moment, the right length of moment, not too brief to seem evasive, not too long to seem deliberate, and said that in mid-March she had received a delivery of pork from one of the farm suppliers that had seemed slightly off in odor, and she had rejected it and arranged for a replacement delivery. She gave him the supplier's name, she gave him the date. All of it was documentable, and none of it was relevant. But it gave Schreiber something to investigate that led nowhere. He thanked her. He made notes. He left the kitchen. He never came back. The official German investigation concluded in early May 1943. The formal finding, preserved in records that would not be accessible to historians until after the war, attributed the outbreak to probable environmental contamination of the garrison water supply via proximity to forested areas with documented wildlife disease activity. It was the best Schreiber and his colleagues could manage. They knew, because they were physicians and not administrators, that this explanation was inadequate. The symptom profile and the disease progression were consistent with rabies, but rabies acquired through a communal water supply was, scientifically, essentially impossible. The virus does not survive in standing water. It requires direct contact with infected nervous tissue or saliva. They knew something was wrong with their conclusion. They filed it anyway, because the alternative, that someone had deliberately introduced rabies into the food supply of an SS garrison, was a conclusion that, if filed, would require them to explain to Berlin how a Polish cook had managed to poison 200 German soldiers while the garrison's security apparatus watched and noticed nothing. That conclusion was more dangerous to file than the wrong one. Of the 207 soldiers who developed symptoms, 184 survived. 23 did not. Rabies, once symptomatic, kills with near total efficiency in the absence of treatment, and the garrison's medical capacity was not equipped for the level of intensive neurological support the most severe cases required. Laub himself survived. He was among the 47 men in the garrison who never became symptomatic, either because they had a natural resistance, or because they had eaten less of the infected sausage, or because, in a random cruelty that Helena had no control over, the distribution of the viral load across 200 servings was uneven, and the men who happened to receive the highest concentrations were not necessarily the men she would have chosen. She had not tried to choose. She could not choose. Sausage is served communally, in slices, from a common platter. She had no mechanism for directing the infected portions towards specific individuals. She fed the garrison. The garrison ate. The distribution was chance, which is another way of saying the distribution was war, which does not distinguish between the deserving and the accidental. This troubled her. She acknowledged it in the 1967 testimony, speaking to a documentation researcher who sat across from her in a Warsaw apartment and took careful notes. "I did not want to kill them all," she said. "I did not want to kill any of them, exactly. What I wanted was to stop them, to make them unable to continue what they were doing, to reduce them by 200 for however long I could." She paused. "But that is not quite honest either. I wanted them to suffer. I will not pretend otherwise. I wanted the men who had executed my neighbors and deported my husband to experience something they could not control and could not understand. I wanted them to be afraid." Was she afraid? The researcher asked this. She thought about it for a moment. "Not of being caught," she said. "I was afraid that it wouldn't work, that I had made a mistake in the calculation somewhere, that I would watch the weeks pass and nothing would happen and I would have to decide whether to try again." She looked at her hands, which by 1967 had the look of a woman who had worked with them for 60 years. "And then the first men began to get sick, and I was afraid of a different thing. I was afraid of what I had done. This is the part the hero narratives leave out. The moment it works, the moment the plan succeeds. The women who fought this way, the cooks and cleaners and couriers and spies, the women who weaponized the invisibility that the occupation assigned them, they were not insulated from the consequences of their actions by the fact that their actions were just. They felt it. They watched men die of something they had introduced, and whatever those men were, whatever they had done, they were also human beings whose deaths had a texture and a sound. Helena could hear the garrison's medical ward from her kitchen. The sounds of hydrophobia, the panic, the spasm, the howling at water, came through the stone walls on certain nights. She cooked through it. She cooked the clean meals, the uncontaminated meals, with perfect professionalism. She plated and served and cleaned, and at night she lay on her cot and listened to what she had made happen. And she did not sleep well, and she told no one. Agata Chmielowska knew the broad outlines. Gruchalski knew his piece of it. The men who had worked the forest knew their piece. No single person, except Helena, knew all of it. This was deliberate. This was also, she understood, a form of loneliness that had no name. The 7th Garrison Company was withdrawn from the Potocki estate in late May 1943. The survivors were redistributed to other postings. The estate was reassigned to a different administrative function. A new garrison company was expected to take up residence in October. Helena remained in the kitchen. She cooked for the skeleton administrative staff that maintained the estate during the transitional period. She received no new assignment for 4 months. During those 4 months she was, in the garrison's administrative records, simply a cook on the payroll of Fassbinder's office, drawing her small salary, performing her duties, invisible. In September 1943, she received a message through the network from Agata Chmielowska. It was brief. It said, "The Gestapo has opened an inquiry into the garrison illness. They are interviewing former kitchen staff. You should consider your position." Helena considered it for 48 hours. Then she arranged, through the network, the documentation she needed. An identity card in the name of a woman who had died of typhus in a Krakow hospital in February 1942. A travel permit, a work reference letter for a food service position in Tarnów. She spent the following 6 weeks behaving entirely normally. She cooked. She maintained her schedule. She appeared, to anyone watching, to be a woman with no plans beyond the next kitchen shift. On a grey Tuesday morning in January 1944, she left the Potocki estate with her small cloth bag and her kitchen knife wrapped in brown paper. She told Benedict she was going to the market and would be back before noon. She walked to a tram stop 4 streets away, took the tram to the central station, boarded a train to Tarnów, and did not return. The Gestapo inquiry found nothing. There was nothing to find. There was a kitchen ledger full of meticulous, accurate records for every food production run, except the 4 that had mattered. There was a grinder that had processed thousands of kilograms of ordinary pork sausage. There were 4 Polish kitchen assistants who knew only what their supervisor had shown them, and what she had shown them was how to make excellent soup. There was a gap in the payroll records from January 1944, where Helena Górska's name had simply stopped appearing. The inquiry noted the gap. They investigated the identity she had used to leave. They found the dead woman in the Krakow hospital records and stopped looking. She surfaced in the documentation once more. Briefly, in 1945. A Red Cross registration form, filed in a transit camp outside Lublin in the weeks after liberation, lists a woman named Helena Górska, born 1912, occupation, cook. The form notes she is seeking information regarding child Agnieszka Górska, believed residing in village east of Kraków. There is a handwritten note at the bottom of the form, in different ink, added sometime later. Family reunited, March 1945. Agnieszka survived the war at her grandparents' farm. She was 7 years old when her mother sent her away, and nearly 8 when the Germans arrived, and 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. And she remembered her mother the way children remember people who disappear, in specific sensory fragments, not in a coherent narrative. The smell of a kitchen, a particular way of holding a knife, the quality of stillness in a person who has decided something difficult and isn't going to change their mind. Helena never wrote a memoir. She gave the one recorded testimony in 1967 and declined to elaborate further. She died in Warsaw in 1989, 2 months before the wall came down in Berlin, at the age of 70. She had worked as a cook for most of her post-war life, in restaurant kitchens, in hospital cafeterias, in a school canteen for the last 12 years of her employment. People who worked with her described a woman who was meticulous, quiet, and possessed of an extraordinary ability to produce meals of surprising quality from very limited ingredients. They described a woman who seemed always to know exactly what she was doing and never seemed to second-guess herself, except occasionally in the middle of the night, when the people who lived near her sometimes heard her moving around her apartment in the small hours, making tea, sitting by the window, watching whatever it was she watched in the dark streets below. The 1967 testimony runs to 47 pages. Most of it is logistical: the sourcing of the infected material, the production method, the security precautions. The researcher who conducted the interview, a woman named Helena Górska, who spent 30 years documenting Polish civilian resistance, noted in her own records that Helena spoke about the mechanics with far greater ease than she spoke about the experience of it. She could describe the grinding process for 20 minutes without any visible emotional response, Górska wrote. When I asked her how she felt during the weeks when the soldiers were dying, she was quiet for almost a full minute. Then she said, "I felt like a cook. I felt like I was responsible for what came out of my kitchen." Responsible for what came out of her kitchen. Consider what that means. Consider the doubling in that phrase. The professional pride of a woman who had spent her entire adult life defining herself by the quality of what she produced, applied now to an act that no chef's school had a category for. Consider the self-discipline it required to remain, through everything, the cook, to never break the frame, to never give the men around her a reason to look at her differently, to stand at the grinder and do what she had decided to do, and then walk out of the kitchen and plate the evening meal, and take it to the dining room and watch 200 men eat, and to give none of it away. They never looked at her. That was the point. That was always the point. The women who fought this way did not fight despite their invisibility. They fought with it. They wielded it. They made it into a weapon more effective than anything the Allies dropped from aircraft. The assumption that a cook was just a cook, that a woman in an apron was beneath consideration, that the person responsible for your food was too simple and too subordinate to be dangerous. That assumption killed 23 SS soldiers and put 184 more out of commission for months. That assumption handed Helena Górska the most unmonitored access in the entire garrison. That assumption was the Germans' only real failure of intelligence, and it was not a failure of surveillance or encryption or counter-espionage. It was a failure of imagination. They could not imagine what was standing in front of them. They could not conceive of the specific danger of a woman who knew what she was doing, in a kitchen they had decided was beneath their notice. The history of women's resistance in World War II is full of this failure. It is the recurring mechanism, the same structural blindness exploited by different women in different kitchens and bedrooms, and hospital wards and filing rooms across occupied Europe, used to pass messages, move weapons, hide men, photograph documents, poison supplies. The occupiers' conviction that women were domesticated and therefore safe was the most expensive conviction they held. It cost them, across the full breadth of the occupation in ways that no comprehensive accounting has ever been made. Helena Górska's specific contribution to that accounting was 207 sick men, 23 dead, 1 garrison withdrawn, 1 Gestapo inquiry that went nowhere, and 47 pages of testimony delivered 24 years later in a Warsaw apartment, and 1 daughter reunited. March 1945, Helena Górska tried to have the testimony published in the 1970s. She was told by the committee overseeing the documentation project that the account was difficult to verify through independent sources, and that the method described raises ethical questions that complicate the framing of the subject as a resistance hero. The testimony was filed. It remained filed for decades, accessible to researchers who knew to look for it, invisible to everyone else, difficult to verify, raises ethical questions. The language of institutions protecting themselves from the discomfort of a story that doesn't fit the available categories. Helena Górska did not fight with a gun or a bomb or a radio transmitter. She fought with a grinder and a spice rack, and 30 years of professional knowledge and the specific form of moral courage required to look at a terrible situation and say, I have tools, I have access, I have one opportunity to reduce the capacity of these men to continue what they are doing, and then to act on that calculation, alone in the middle of the night, in a stone room 300 meters from the men she intended to destroy. The ethics are genuinely complicated. 23 men died of a disease she introduced. 14 of those men have been identified through post-war research as participants in mass executions in the eastern districts of Kraków in 1942 and 1943. The remaining 9 were ordinary soldiers, young men, most of them, conscripts or volunteers who had not distinguished themselves in atrocity and had not distinguished themselves in resistance. They ate the sausage. They died. Helena had no mechanism for distinguishing between them and the 14. War does not offer that mechanism. That is one of the things war takes: the ability to choose precisely, to calibrate justice to the individual, to ensure that the moral weight of your actions falls exactly where you intend it. Helena Górska understood this. She said so in the 47th page of the testimony, in the last substantive passage before the researchers' closing notes. I did not know their names. I did not know which of them had done what. I knew they were soldiers of the SS in an occupied city that was killing my people, and I knew that I could reduce their number. Whether I had the right to do that, I do not know. I have never known, but I knew that if I did nothing, if I stood in my kitchen and cooked their clean meals and told myself that I was only a cook and this was not my war, I would have been lying. It was my war. It was my kitchen. And I used what I had, what you had, a farmhouse kitchen in 1920, your mother's hands scrubbing a cast iron pot, the smell of rendered lard on a winter morning, the encyclopedia of animal sickness that a farming childhood burned into you before you knew it was useful. What you had, 8 years in a restaurant kitchen, mastering the specific machinery of meat preparation. What you had, the German administrative assumption that you were furniture, which gave you more freedom of movement than any forged document could. What you had, a forest full of infected animals and a veterinarian who asked the right questions. What you had, nothing left to lose, and 30 years of professional skill, and a morning in November when you found a dead fox in the tall grass and understood, with the specific clarity that comes from years of accurate observation, exactly what you were looking at. She used what she had. In a kitchen in occupied Kraków, alone, in the middle of a war that was killing everything around her, she looked at the tools in front of her, and she decided what to make. Whether it was right is a question that will not be resolved here. It has not been resolved in 50 years of intermittent historical discussion, and it will not be resolved by any formula this account can offer. What can be said is that it was real. It happened. A woman stood at a butcher's block in a garrison kitchen and did something that 231 trained soldiers and their physicians and their investigators could not explain. And then she walked out of the building and went home. The Germans called it an incident of unknown origin. She called it cooking.